Senator, I have a series of questions and some comments. First, I come from a predominantly rural state. A very high number of gun owners, a very low rate of gun crime. What you're talking about here today of adding the terrorist watch list as one of the elements of the background check and covering the non-covered parts of gun sales, online gun shows, will that have any practical effect on the gun owners in Maine?
It won't have any practical effect on the law-abiding gun owners in Maine, and that's who you and I are talking to. The only effect that it would have is upon criminals or felons that are attempting to circumvent our laws and get weapons by avoiding criminal background checks. The only effect that it would have is if there were individuals on Maine who were the subject of terrorist investigations, they would be prevented from buying weapons. But of course, even those individuals, if they thought that they were on the list for the wrong reasons, would have a process to grieve that. But for law-abiding citizens in Maine or Connecticut or Pennsylvania or New Jersey, this law has no impact on them.
It'll have no practical effect. They'll still be able to buy guns either place. They'd have to go through the instant background check and the law that as if they were a felon or something like that, then they would be prevented. But other than that, this isn't going to have any practical effect on the law-abiding gun owners in Maine.
It will have no effect on law-abiding gun owners in Maine or anywhere else. This has nothing to do with those individuals.
I want to take a slightly different view than I've heard today on the issue of terrorism. I'm on the Intelligence Committee. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon that we're in session, we meet upstairs in an enclosed room. And ever since I've been here in January of 2013, the subject, in one way or another, has been terrorism, has been the threats that this country is facing around the world. And what's happened in the last 4 years is a subtle change in the nature of that threat. And when we first came, we were talking about Al-Qaeda. We were talking about plots. We were talking about people coming here using airplanes, otherwise penetrating this country from abroad. What's happened is that the terrorist threat has become homegrown. In fact, there's even a term for it of homegrown extremists or local terrorists. And ISIS is here. Every place there is a computer with an internet connection, ISIS is there. And people like the shooter in Orlando may never go to the Middle East. I think he actually had traveled, but many of the people that are involved in this threat to our nation never leave the United States. So here's what we're doing, and here's why your amendment makes so much sense. Because we are spending millions of dollars, in fact, billions over the past 15 years to counteract this terrorist threat. And it suddenly occurred to me as I was thinking through it, we're spending millions of dollars to bomb ISIS's weapons supplies in Syria and Iraq, and they can buy their weapons here. How much sense does that make? It just is crazy that we are spending millions of dollars to interdict their weapons supply, and yet the people who are here, who are under their thrall, who are thinking about terrorist acts and who they are inspiring to these acts, can walk out and get a gun without any hesitation as long as they don't violate one of the terms of the current law. The other piece of this that I think is important is that the current law that has the list of prohibitions, mental illness, felony, domestic violence, there are 9, was passed in 1993. The world is enormously and fundamentally different than it was in 1993. In 1993, we'd barely heard of Al-Qaeda. There was no ISIS. There was very little threat or acknowledgement or understanding of domestic terrorism whatsoever, but now we're in terrorism 2.0. And what happened in Orlando is exactly what we've been hearing about in the Intelligence Committee, what's been predicted by all of our intelligence officials, what many of us have been talking about. It's the nightmare scenario, an American who is radicalized online, who goes out and gets a gun and kills 50 people. That is the hardest threat to stop, because there's no plot, there's no email trail, there are very little phone calls, there's nothing, it's hard for our intelligence community to track someone like that. But if we have some knowledge of them, if they're in our database, to me it just makes common sense that that should be added to the list of disqualifications for buying guns. And this is no threat to anybody who's not on such a list. And I understand, and you can please comment, that the legislation that we're talking about has a constitutional escape hatch for people who are wrongly on the list or whose names are mixed up. And they will have an opportunity to protest that listing and have their names expunged if they can make the case that there was something wrong with them being on the list. Is that correct?
It is correct. It is correct, and that's an important facet of the amendment that Senator Feinstein has introduced. But it's also important, as we remarked earlier, perhaps when you were on the floor, Senator King, to understand the scope of this. We're talking about a very small number of sales that actually would be affected. In 2015, thanks to a report that Senator Feinstein released, we know that in that year, there were only about 215 sales at gun stores to individuals that were on the terrorist watch list. So it's a very small number of sales that we're talking about in the first place.
But if someone said, well, if that's such a small number, why are we bothering? Because it only takes one to kill 50 people.
Correct.
And that's really the essence of what you're talking about. Now, as I understand it, there are two parts of what we're talking about today. And by the way, you're not talking about assault weapons ban, you're not talking about magazine controls, you're not talking about any of those things. We're really talking about two things. Terrorist watch list, if you're on the list, you can't buy a gun. No fly, no buy. The second is to fill the loopholes in the background check system, because as I understand your argument, if we say if you're on the watch list you can't buy a gun, but there's this gaping 40% loophole where you could get a gun without any check whatsoever, then it doesn't matter. Anybody, the felon, anybody can get a gun under that circumstance. Is that the logical progression?
That's exactly right. And I think you very smartly referred back to the initiation of the background check system, in which no one was contemplating a terrorist watch list or a no-fly list existing. Well, that's the same thing with internet sales. That's the same thing with armlist.com. It's the same thing with gun shows. Back when we passed the background checks law, the vast majority of gun sales was done at bricks and mortar stores. What has happened is that sales have migrated into other forms, especially online. And so in all of these respects, I think you're accurately pointing out that all we are really seeking to do is to have the law and the initial intent of it catch up with the trajectory of time.
And I find it hard to believe that if we were debating that law in 1993 under the current circumstances, that some cognizance wouldn't have been taken of the risk of domestic terrorism.
I don't think there would have been any question that that category would have been included. That is probably why 80% of Americans support the adoption of this amendment or some version of it.
By the way, I would mention that since you have been on the floor today, 10 people have been murdered with guns. It's about one an hour.
Yeah.
Since the Orlando shooting, 100 people, twice as many as in Orlando, have been murdered with guns. So we're talking about Orlando, but we're also talking about people all over the country, mostly innocent people, sometimes people victims of domestic violence. And we're talking about, not about taking guns away from people, we're talking about keeping people who shouldn't have them from getting guns. And I've never met a gun owner who doesn't agree that that's just a common sense restriction.
Yeah.
Do you view this in any way as a violation of the Second Amendment?
Senator Udall was on the floor earlier, and he said somebody called his office earlier today asking why we were debating the Second Amendment today. And of course, the answer to that is we're not debating the Second Amendment. There's actually nothing about this debate that's relevant to the Second Amendment because the Second Amendment is clear. As the Supreme Court has stated, an individual has a right to own a firearm. But as that same court very clearly stated in an opinion by Justice Scalia himself, that right is not absolute. The Congress has the ability to say that there are some weapons that should be out of bounds. There are some individuals who are so dangerous that they shouldn't own weapons. And so even the most conservative jurists on the Supreme Court have held very plainly that the Second Amendment allows for the Congress or for state legislatures to decide that there are certain individuals, felons, people that have been convicted of violent crimes, or individuals that we suspect of terrorist activities that shouldn't buy a weapon. And of course, as we remarked earlier, if you go into any gun club in Maine or Connecticut, that is what people are going to believe in those forums as well. They believe that law-abiding citizens should be able to get any weapons that they want, by and large, but they don't believe that criminals should be able to buy weapons. That's a view held by gun owners and non-gun owners alike, because everyone accepts that it is in keeping with the Second Amendment.
But don't you think that one of the problems with this debate, as it's evolved over the past few years, it's become a kind of either or?
Right.
If you're for the Second Amendment, there are no limitations whatsoever. And if you talk about limitations, you're against the Second Amendment. Do you accept that characterization?
I think you're exactly right. And I think this has become an either-or debate in so many different respects. I'm so glad you're weaving together this question of how we respond to terrorism and how we protect Americans from the consequences of loose gun laws, because there's also this juxtaposition in which these terrorist attacks are either about the fight against ISIS or they're about our loose gun laws. And they're about both. And this shooting in Orlando is about a whole host of other subjects as well. And so I think we have tried to stay true to the complexity of this question on the floor during this time. We are not suggesting that what we are proposing is going to solve the problem. But we do have to get out of this paradigm in which, if you're a supporter of the Second Amendment, you can't support any restrictions on individuals, whether or not they're on the terrorist watch list, to obtain guns.
Well, this solution that's being proposed, even if it only prevents one person, that could be 50 lives or 100 lives. And I think that's important. By the way, it's a dirty trick, Senator, to quote Justice Scalia on the subject. And he did make it clear in the Heller Amendment, as you point out, that the Second Amendment, as the First Amendment or any of the amendments, are not absolute. People say the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting speech. But you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. That's established law. And Justice Scalia in the Heller decision said the same thing about the Second Amendment. It's not absolute. There are limitations that can be placed upon it, particularly in the transfer of firearms. And I think that's what we're talking about here. So I commend the senator, and I believe that what we're talking about, and let me go back to the Intelligence Committee for a minute. It took me 2 or 3 months. Maybe I'm a slow learner, but I'm sitting in the Intelligence Committee, and I finally had 2 really visceral insights. One was, we're the only people watching the intelligence community. That we've got this large apparatus, and we've got these small committees in the House and the Senate, and we're the only people watching. That's not relevant to this debate, but that was an important realization that imposed upon me what I thought was an extraordinary responsibility to pay close attention to what these agencies are doing. The second insight was that the fundamental role of the Intelligence Committee, and I would argue the fundamental role of this body, is to constantly monitor and calibrate the tension that exists between 2 fundamental provisions of the Constitution, in this case 3. The first is in the preamble. Fundamental reason that this government was formed in the first place: to ensure domestic tranquility and provide for the common defense. That's the essence of any government. Fundamental, sacred responsibility. And then we have the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, Fourth and Fifth Amendment that have issues of privacy, issues of gun ownership, and we have to constantly balance and calibrate those provisions based upon technology and reality, circumstances, facts. And we have a new set of facts. We are facing a threat today in the United States that's different than what we have ever faced before, where we have people who are being motivated from abroad mostly, but are in our society, in our country. This fellow in Orlando was an American citizen, born here. And we've got to take cognizance of that. We've got to take account of that reality. If we don't, we're failing, it seems to me, our fundamental responsibility under the preamble of the Constitution to provide for the common defense. That's what the people of America expect us to do, to keep them safe. And this is simply one piece of the armor that we can provide to keep the people of America safe. I would conclude with a question to the senator. Is there any hope of getting this accomplished? Where are we? Why is this so hard? This seems to be a common sense response. And I read a quote from the NRA today that said, "We believe that terrorists should not have guns." So is there room for discussion, for compromise? Do you feel that there is an opportunity here to get to a place where we can respond to this new threat that's facing us without in any way compromising the values of the Second Amendment?
I thank the senator for guiding us towards that compromise, because it has to be there. And we are, on this issue, we are speaking the same language. Frankly, on background checks, we tend to speak the same language. We both say, Republicans and Democrats, that we don't want criminals to get guns. We both say that we don't want terrorists to get guns, and yet we have been unable to meet in the middle. My understanding is that the majority has a concern about the ability of individuals who shouldn't be on these lists to get off the list. So do we. We have no less interest in due process than they do. And so we want to bring these issues to a vote on the floor, but our preference is to bring a compromise measure that can pass and get the support of both sides. I know that we've had Senator Toomey and some others come to the floor today and suggest that there's some work to be done to get a compromise, and my hope is that we can get there. If we can't, then let's at least take the vote and let the American people see where we stand.
But my understanding is the amendment as proposed does provide specific process whereby a person who believes that they are wrongfully on the list, wrongfully denied the opportunity to purchase a firearm, they have the opportunity to contest that, to have it litigated, and have it resolved in a reasonably prompt manner.
And I think that has been the difficulty in finding this compromise. The existing text gives the ability already for anyone who believes that they are on the list wrongly to get off that list. That's why I said that we are just as concerned with that, and the underlying amendment that we have proposed, that Senator Feinstein has proposed, does exactly that. It gives an escape hatch for anyone that is on that list wrongly.
One of the odd things about this debate is that if this had been 15 years ago, I don't think we'd be even having this debate. This would have been done, background checks was generally uncontroversial. And if we'd had the terrorist threat, I can't believe it wouldn't have been. We've got domestic violence on there. How about terrorism violence? That should be part of this as well, and that's all you're really proposing. Is that correct?
That is correct. It's only controversial here, Senator King. It's not controversial out in the American public. They want this done, by and large, so we've created a controversy that really doesn't exist in the living rooms and social halls of this country.
I thank the senator, and thank you for your answers, and thank you for your leadership on this issue. Well, I'd like to discuss with the senator and bring back to the point that we were discussing some 4 hours ago. It seems hard to believe it was 4 hours ago, but that this is really a national security discussion. This is really a national security discussion because of the changed nature of our adversaries and the changed strategy that they have for attacking us. But first, I want to go back to the Constitution. And purely by coincidence, I'm wearing today the Constitution. My daughter bought me this tie at the Library of Congress, and it is the handwritten version of the Constitution. You can see "We the People" in very large letters. Why are governments formed? Why are constitutions written? Going back to the earliest human societies, the fundamental function of bestowing power on a government is to protect you. Security is the fundamental most sacred obligation of any government, and our framers recognize that because in the preamble to the Constitution, the heart of the document, why we're doing this, the framers were explaining to posterity, and two of the fundamental purposes, among several others, are to ensure domestic tranquility and provide for the common defense. The basic function of any government and the explicit function of our government. Now, here are three important dates: 1812, 2001, and 2016. 1812, because that was the last time an adversary violated our shores. That was when Washington was burned by the British. It was the last invasion of America until 2001. But 2001 and 1812 have some similarities because 2001 was in effect a foreign invasion. It was plotted abroad, it was planned abroad, and people came here from outside of our shores and attacked our country. Now, in response to that attack in 2001, we mobilized a number of resources. We developed ways of protecting our aircraft. We developed great intelligence ability to determine when people were plotting against us, and indeed, we sent our blood and treasure and young people to Afghanistan because it was a haven for terrorists. That was the reason we went there, and in fact are still there, to keep that country from becoming an incubator for terrorists to attack this country. We have been effective. We have been effective in preventing an attack on our country from abroad. So, as is always the case with warfare, our adversaries have developed a new strategy. And that's why the third date I mentioned is 2016. It was in the last few years, particularly in the last year as ISIS has begun to be beaten back and to lose its territory in Syria and Iraq, that they've developed a new strategy which doesn't involve sending people here, it doesn't involve sending arms here or bombs or anything else. It involves using the internet to radicalize people who are already here, often they're US citizens, and then to turn them against us. That's the new nature. This is terrorism 2.0. That's the nature of the struggle that we're in now, and that's why the amendment that is being proposed makes so much sense from a point of view of national security. If we discover an arms cache in Syria, we bomb it. But if ISIS wants to attack us here with terrorism 2.0, we sell them weapons. It makes no sense. The first rule of warfare is disarm your enemies if you can. And that's exactly what we're talking about. And I think a lot of people they just say, well, this is just another gun control debate. This is another, we're talking about gun control. We're talking about national security. We're talking about defending ourselves from a strategy that relies upon people being able to acquire guns easily in this country, people who are terrorists or who are inspired by the terrorists or who want to be terrorists. And we can't have a bill that says you have to have probable cause to show you've already committed a terrorist act. That's too late. It has to be preventative. And that's what we're talking about here today. So I think it's very important to remind ourselves that this is really a national security bill. And it makes no sense to close the terrorist loophole unless you close the gun show loophole. Because the terrorists aren't stupid. The terrorist APB that they send out from somewhere else in the world to tell somebody, go get a gun and kill people, will also say, by the way, do it at a gun show or do it online because they won't check you. You've already read the quote from the Al-Qaeda operative that explicitly told people to do that. So if we don't do both things, it really is a false security. We're kidding ourselves. So we have to do one, close the terrorist loophole. I would venture to say 90% of the American people agree with that. When you walk up to people on the street and say, you think people should be able to be prevented from getting on airplanes, but they should be able to buy guns, they look at you like you're crazy. That doesn't make any sense. And yes, there are constitutional provisions built into the amendment that we're talking about that allow people who are wrongfully on that list have an opportunity to get off the list and to contest that designation. So this isn't some kind of wholesale violation of the Second Amendment. This respects the Second Amendment and is based upon the premise that due process is available in this situation. But then we have to close the gun show loophole and the online loophole, because otherwise doing the first thing just isn't going to be effective. So the two things together, to me, are national security and personal security, because of all the other tragedies that we've talked about here tonight that don't involve Al-Qaeda or ISIS or al-Nusra or al-Shabaab or any of the other terrorist organizations, but involve our individual citizens being killed in just stunning numbers. Since we've started talking here today, since you took this floor, 12 people have been murdered by guns. 1 an hour, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. So we've got a national security reason to do this, and we've also, remember the preamble back, and I'll finish with my question. The preamble has two pieces. Provide for the common defense. That's what I've been talking about, national security. Ensure domestic tranquility. That means keeping people safe here. Not from enemies abroad, but from criminal elements within our own society. Again, the most fundamental and sacred obligation of we as a government. If we don't do this, we are committing constitutional malpractice. We are not abiding by the most sacred obligation in our Constitution to keep our people safe. And it can be done consistent with the Second Amendment, respectful of the Second Amendment, but in a way that will fundamentally realize the promise that the Constitution makes to all Americans that their government will protect them from foreign attack and from domestic unrest. So I asked the senator, do you view this as, in large measure, a national security issue?
I thank the senator for Maine, and especially because, as he mentioned in his previous comments, he sits on the Intelligence Committee, and so he's frankly privy to information that he likely cannot state on the floor, but is directly on point, which is this notion that these terrorist groups, whether it be Al-Qaeda and ISIS, now are more dependent than ever on inspiring and launching lone wolf attacks. Why? Because they are losing ground in Syria and in Iraq, and this notion that there was going to be an inevitable caliphate that was going to grow and prosper and control large amounts of territory in the Middle East, that is no longer a reality. And as someone earlier today said on the floor, there's a record low trickle of American citizens today going abroad, maybe it was you, to join Al-Qaeda, suggests how their pull, how their gravitational pull has been greatly reduced. And it means that there are right ways and wrong ways to engage in this second front, this effort to try to launch lone wolf attacks. The wrong way is to marginalize Muslim communities in this country by telling them that they are less than, by telling them that they are threats by nature of their ethnicity or their religion to the United States. I would yield. For a question.
On February 15th of 2015, Dabiq, which is the sort of public newspaper of ISIS, published an explicit strategy for what they hope will become a worldwide conflict. And the strategy is that Westerners will fall into the trap of persecuting Muslims and drive them into the arms of the radicals. That's a strategy. So to the extent that we persecute and marginalize these overwhelmingly peaceful citizens who want to be citizens of our country or citizens of other countries in the world, we are doing their job. They said that's what we want to do, and indeed some people in our society have fallen into that trap and are doing it, and this is exactly what they want, because they want this to be a war between Islam and the West. And do we really want to radicalize 1.6 billion people and 3.3 million here in this country, the vast majority of whom want nothing more than what the rest of us want, which is to raise our families and live our lives and enjoy the benefits of this wonderful country? So I agree with the senator and would ask him if he concurs that if we're marginalizing people of any faith, then in this particular case, we're driving them into the arms of our adversaries.
The name Dabiq itself, which is the name of the publication that this organization that ISIS sends to the rest of the world, is rooted in a spot that is representative to this terrorist group of the historic clash between East and West. And so the entire orthodoxy of ISIS is based in this idea that they can convince would-be converts that this is a fight between the Muslim faith and the Christian faith, which just again speaks to the fact that there are right ways and wrong ways to go about fulfilling the mission that you have articulated in the preamble to the Constitution. The wrong way is to blame these attacks on everyone who shares the Muslim faith. The right way is to target the very small subset of individuals of any faith that have connections to terrorist groups. And the good news is that because of a network of surveillance that we have endorsed, we can do much better than before in finding what individuals have had contact with terrorist groups. And when we find that out, it simply makes sense that we shouldn't sell them weapons. I thank the gentleman for
his answers and for his leadership on this issue.